Hello, hello. We're in Haftarah Terumah. This is in 1 Kings chapter 5, verses 26 all the way through chapter 6, verse 13. So this Haftarah discusses the building of the temple by Solomon. And the Torah portion that corresponds to this Haftarah, of course, talks about the tabernacle, that movable sanctuary that the Israelites carried with them throughout the wilderness. Now, so central was this tabernacle to the people that we actually get 5 Torah portions devoted to the tabernacle. Isn't that amazing? That's like 1/3 of the whole book of Exodus. And I heard it said one time that the creation account just gets 34 verses. Okay, so like if word count means anything, then this meeting place, the tabernacle, the meeting place between God and mankind, this is vitally important, right? Now, the Torah portion and the Haftarah, they're tied together with a particular phrase that's found in each. When in the Torah it talks about the tabernacle, it says that God said, "They will make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them." And that's in Exodus 25:3. And in our Haftarah this week, it's chapter 6, verse 12 and 13, and it says the same thing. Make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. Now, in both cases, with the Haftarah and the Torah portion, um, this dwelling place, this isn't a place for God to live, but it's a place for the people who belong to God, for them to feel his presence. Okay? Now, to feel his presence, that should take us back to the feeling and the situation, those moments back on Mount Sinai, right? Where we as a people experienced the glory of God. And that was it manifest by the cloud that was said to dwell on the mountain. In Exodus 24:17, it says that the glory of God dwelled on Mount Sinai, and that the cloud covered it for 6 days, and then God called to Moses on the seventh day from this cloud. Okay. Now, when the tabernacle, so we're going to jump to the Torah portion for just a bit. So when the tabernacle was first described in this week's Torah portion, when the tabernacle was completed, the dedication of the tabernacle had a similar description to that on Mount Sinai, because in Exodus 40, verse 34, it says that the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. And then much later in 2 Kings, speaking of the temple, that's the subject of our Haftarah, it says that the cloud filled the house of God. So we know that the tabernacle provided an ongoing experience of the presence of God, like what was experienced at the mountain. And that's what it means, the phrase, "I will dwell among them," which is that tie-in from the Haftarah and the Torah portion. So through the tabernacle in the wilderness and then the temple in Jerusalem, God provides a way for people to enter into his presence in a kind of physical intimacy that's not possible any other way this side of the garden in our fallen world, right? So the tabernacle and then the temple, these both are like little pieces of the Garden of Eden where mankind, Adam, Eve, were able to walk with God in the cool of the day. And when you start to study out the temple, you're going to see a lot of garden motifs, which we won't get into in this lesson. Um, each part of and each aspect of the temple and its protocols, they are designed to work with our fallen humanity, um, sort of elevating us to a place where we're able to experience God. And when you think about it that way, think about the temple that way, this is his tremendous mercy that he has toward us, right? Now, in our Haftarah, Solomon builds this temple, and this temple rivals anything else, any other temple to any god that Solomon would have known about, right? But there's something interesting about God's temple's location. It's built on a plateau. So it's built on a small hill, and then there's these larger hills that are surrounding it, right? Now, most of the time, the pagan temples, they would have purposely been built on one of the highest places so as to elevate the status of the god that was being served there, right? So the god's abode was elevated above its subjects. But God's special dwelling place isn't on the highest hill. Why? Well, many reasons, but one is so that he can dwell where we are. Isn't that amazing? And see how that contrasts the gods of the world, right? And yet, when we talk about going to Jerusalem or going to the Temple Mount, we always say going up, right? And that's because God is already high and lifted up. Now, in our Haftarah, God makes this special point to tell Solomon that just building the temple isn't enough, that the people need to maintain this closeness with him, demonstrated by guarding the Torah, right? And then God will use the temple as like the focus point for his presence. But if the people don't guard God's wisdom, then what's the temple? It's just like this ornate building, right? Now, I don't think it's so much that God's presence would leave the temple if people disobeyed Torah. I think it's that the purpose of the temple was communion between the Israelites and God, where he's their king and their sovereign, and they're his people. So if they're not listening to him, if they're not shemaing him, if they're not attuning their lives to him, then really what would be the need for this temple, which is this meeting place with God, right? So I kind of think that's more the sense of what's going on here. Not that if you don't check off this list of do's and don'ts, my presence will leave you. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So this temple, right, this house, it's not just wood and stones and the things that made up the temple. It's like going in the ways of God, being attuned to him, right? That's the house. It's in the hearts of the people, and that's reflected in the physical house, right? So the temple was this physical manifestation of the close relationship that is supposed to be, that's designed to be between God and his people. So no relationship, no need for a house. Now, in our Haftarah this week, in chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, it says that the word of the Lord came to Solomon and said, as for this temple that you're building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, keep my commandments, obey them, shema them, then I will fulfill through you the promise that I gave to David my father, which is what? That I will dwell among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel. Okay? So it's the king that sets the tone for the people. If the king follows after God, then the Holy One will dwell among his people. If the king does not, then the Lord will turn away as well, right? As represented by his presence leaving the temple. Now, God told the people this would happen when they said, we want a king just like all the other nations. And the father's saying, well, that isn't going to go well for you. Okay, so now we have this problem, right? Solomon messed up. And many of the subsequent Davidic kings after Solomon, not only did they mess up, but some of them were just absolutely wicked. Those weren't the kings that were going to take us as a people where we need to be, right? It takes a godly king, a very special king, someone who has zeal for God's house, someone who is fully Torah observant, right? We all need a king who says, uh, why were you looking for me anyplace else but in the temple? Didn't you know that I had to be about my father's business? Right? We need a king who's not afraid of upsetting the status quo, and clearing out the money changers in the temple courtyard. We need a king who cries out, my house will be called a house of prayer, right? And we need a king who promises us, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. I go to prepare a place for you, and I will come again and receive you to myself. Now, how many of you thought that verse that Yeshua is saying was reference to heaven? In my Father's house are many, many dwelling places. It's temple language. So I like how the writers at First Fruits of Zion said it in their commentary. They have a commentary on the Haftarah. And to close out our lesson, I'm going to read the ending here. So they say to remedy the suffering of Israel and the absence of God's dwelling presence in Jerusalem, we need a Davidic king who will prove faithful to walk in God's statutes, execute his ordinances, and keep all of his commandments. Such a king will rebuild God's house and usher God's dwelling presence back to the temple. Such a king will gather in the exiles of Israel. And they go on to say, Yeshua of Nazareth is the only candidate who can accomplish these things in their fullness, because he alone is without iniquity, a sinless son of David, the living Torah. He's the only candidate who can guarantee those blessings permanently, because he lives forever. He will never die and leave his throne to another Davidic king who might wander from the Lord. Only Yeshua can bring the promises God made to David to completion. That's why the Lord says to him, I will make an everlasting covenant with you according to the faithful mercies shown to David. That's from Isaiah 55, verse 3. May the Lord send him to us a second time, speedily and in our days. I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.